I want to say a little tiny bit more about my own background. Lorraine mentioned that I teach in the history department at Marquette University, which means, by the way, that I'm very lucky for several reasons. For one thing, Marquette's history department is amazing. My colleagues are absolutely incredible. I'm extraordinarily lucky that I ended up here, but I'm also fortunate because I'm from Milwaukee. I'm a local guy. I grew up here, technically in Wauwatosa. My dad still lives in the house that I grew up in the 1960s and 70s. I went to high school here in the early 1980s. So I am one of the rare examples of an academic who found a job in his hometown. That does not happen very often. But the thing that I really want you to know about me is that I haven't been a professor all that long. Lorraine mentioned that I've only been at Marquette for 10 years now, and before that, for 1 year I was at the University of Montana, also a wonderful history department. And before that, I just got my PhD, and you can tell from looking at me that I'm 55 years old. What that means is that for a good 20 years, for much of my adult life, I was not an academic. In fact, for a lot of that time, I was trying hard to avoid an academic career. As you can see, I failed in that endeavor. But for a lot of that time, before I made a midlife switch and became a professional historian, for a whole lot of the time, I was, among other things, an environmental activist. And that matters. For you to understand how I came to this topic, I want you all to know that. I was not a particularly talented environmental activist. I was not a particularly successful one. I was not an important one, but I was a very committed one. And I still am today. That engagement from my youth, from my younger years, today still strongly shapes how I approach the historical topics that I study. And that matters for better and for worse. You all will probably have a better sense than I do of some of my own blind spots on this topic. One of the drawbacks of being a professional historian who immerses themselves in research on a given topic for years and years on end is we can lose our sense of proportion. So you may well have some critical questions to pose to me about the terminology I use, the arguments that I make, the interpretations that I offer, and so on and so forth. And that is exactly as it should be. So in light of my background, moving from an activist to a historian, today I am primarily a scholar of environmental movements rather than a participant in them, but I nonetheless am still influenced and shaped by that part of my personal background. Lorraine mentioned a book that I co-authored. I'm not the primary author. I was one of the two co-authors. The other co-author is my colleague, Janet Beal. She is an environmental activist and writer based in Vermont. And that book came out 26 years ago now. That book came out a while ago. I did not prepare any visuals to share with you today, but I can at least do a little bit of show and tell. This is the original 1995 edition of our book. The full title is Eco-Fascism, Lessons from the German Experience. It's published by AK Press, which was then and is now a major activist press in the radical scene in North America. And then 10 years ago now, in 2011, we published a revised and expanded edition of the book called Eco-Fascism Revisited. Otherwise, I think the subtitle is the same, Lessons from the German Experience. This one is a good deal longer. I wrote a really long epilogue for it to try to update it. As far as I know, they're both still in print if anyone is interested. It does, when you buy books like that, we don't get any royalties from it. When you buy books like that, it helps to support those publishing projects, and they publish really important stuff. But for what it's worth, you kind of don't have to. Virtually all of both versions of those texts are freely available online. If you Google them, you will very likely find them. If not, ask me, and I'm happy to point you to them. So that book, when it came out in 1995, for better and for worse, it helped popularize the term ecofascism. We did not coin it. Janet and I did not invent that term. We borrowed it. It had already been circulating in international environmental circles since the 1970s already. So for a couple of decades before we picked it up and made it the title of our book. But it's also a highly problematic term. if you ask me, even though I bear some responsibility for bringing the term to prominence, I'm not always the biggest fan of the term ecofascism because it is both controversial and easily misunderstood. So just so you know, there are any number of people in the world who use that term to mean radically different things, to mean incompatible things. The different usages of the term can't be squared with one another. Just so you all know, what I mean by that term, what Janet and I meant at the time, what I still mean by it today, is a specific variant of far-right thought and of far-right politics that takes environmental issues seriously. For some of you, that might sound very surprising. For some of you, you may never have heard before that there are people on the far right, both historically and today, who do take environmental issues seriously. In the United States, at least, the more common stance on the political right is not on the far right necessarily, but for established conservatives, the more common stance is to deny that there is much of an environmental crisis, whether that takes the form of climate change denial or downplaying or what have you. The kind of people that I study, they don't buy into that. The kind of people that I'm looking at, the kind of people who I think can accurately be termed eco-fascists, are people who combine two things. One, they have a genuine commitment to environmental politics of some sort. We'll have to talk about exactly what that looks like. And two, they are somehow engaged or affiliated with some form of far-right politics. I try hard not to use that term too broadly. If you ask me, a lot of people, including people on the left, which is me, which is my co-author Janet, we both were heavily involved in left-wing environmental movements at the time that we wrote this book. If you ask me, a lot of people on the left tend to use the term fascism in general much too broadly. I like to nudge us toward using words like that in a somewhat more specific way. Most people on the right aren't fascists, just like most people on the left aren't whatever your favorite term of abuse might be for people on the left. Fascists are a subset, a family, if you will, within the broader, further right wing of the spectrum. And some of those people, historically and today, have in fact taken ecological issues seriously. And they have developed their own far-right version of environmental thought. So that's what people like Janet Beal and myself mean when we talk about ecofascism. Now, the term became much more prominent just a couple of years ago now, less than that, a year and a half ago now, and it became prominent for tragic reasons. You might recall, even though this feels like it was 10 years ago now, given everything else that's happened in the intervening months, but it was actually less than a year and a half ago now. In 2019, of all the terrible things that happened in 2019, there were two anti-immigrant mass murders, in particular, two massacres of mass shootings that killed dozens of people, both of which targeted immigrant communities on opposite sides of the world. The first one happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, and the second one happened in El Paso, Texas, on the Texas-Mexico border. They targeted different immigrant communities. The guy in Christchurch targeted two mosques. He was targeting Muslim communities. The guy in El Paso was targeting what he took to be Latinx communities, Latino or Hispanic communities, but they both targeted immigrant communities. Both of those perpetrators decided to use the term eco-fascist to describe themselves. You might recall that if you paid attention to this at the time, you might recall they both posted manifestos online. I'm not going to give you links to them. They are frightening and terrible and awful documents, if you ask me, but they are very revealing about the mindset of people who think, people who believe, sincerely believe. They're not pretending when they say this. They mean it when they say this. They think that for the sake of preserving the natural world in whatever they view as, quote, their country, whatever country that might be and whatever reason they think it's theirs to begin with, they think that to protect the natural world in their country, they think they need to target immigrants because they think immigrant communities are somehow responsible for environmental destruction. So with the Christchurch and El Paso massacres in 2019, that term, eco-fascism, took off. The number of texts that are now circulating about it, some of them are very smart, very thoughtful texts, by the way. A lot of other people now study this topic. I used to be one of exceedingly few people who took this topic seriously. Now there are a lot of them because it is more on the map, again, for tragic reasons. So I want to offer you 3 theses to help structure my remarks today. And you don't have to agree with these theses. In fact, I encourage you to disagree with them. Once we get to the discussion part of our session today, I would love to get pushback and critical questions and disagreement and debate and that sort of thing. But I want you to know what I think are the main takeaways from studying something like the universe of far-right environmental thought. So my 3 theses, I'm going to put them in very brief and concentrated form. The first one is this. Historically speaking, ecological themes have always been politically ambivalent. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I am pointing to it as a historical fact because it's important for understanding this weird phenomenon of far-right environmentalism. Ecological themes have always been, and I mean in the sense of for the entire history of discernibly modern environmental politics, from the 19th century onward, ecological themes have always been politically ambivalent. They've always swung back and forth from virtually every conceivable point on the political spectrum, from the left to the right, from authoritarian to democratic wings of the spectrum. Any political stance that you can imagine, almost any, has always had at least a few people, sometimes many people, who attached that political viewpoint to some form of environmental politics or ecological politics. I think that's important for us to recognize. For better or worse, it simply is not the case. There is no natural affiliation between liberal politics or progressive politics or left politics and environmentalism. It sometimes looks like that for those of us who grew up post the 1960s in places like the United States. You might reasonably have gotten that impression, but from a historical point of view, that simply is not the case. There's a long history of right-wing versions of environmentalism as well, sometimes radical right-wing versions. Second thesis is that since the 19th century, in Europe, in North America, and in other places, environmental commitment has very often gone hand in hand with authoritarian social beliefs, with strongly right-wing political beliefs, with racial ideologies. That's one of the most consistent themes in the historical research that I do, the strong historical link between environmentalism of some forms, not all environmentalists, but between many forms of environmentalism and various forms of racial ideology, and last but not least, with anti-immigrant sentiment. The same kinds of things that burst onto the scene in 2019, you can trace those back to the 1870s and even earlier in some cases. And again, that's true in Germany, the country that I mostly study. It's true in North American contexts. It's true elsewhere as well. My third and last thesis is that the current rise of the far right around the world, what I would say the last 5 years or so, that rise of the far right has become much more visible. It's actually been happening for longer than just the last 5 years, but it's really taken off, especially in the last half decade or so. The current rise of the far right around the world, not just in the United States, combined with the increasing urgency of the global climate crisis, those 2 factors together, in my view, mean that we need to start paying closer attention to far-right forms of environmentalism because they're not going to go away. If anything, I'm sorry to say, I expect those mixtures of far-right politics and environmental concern, I expect them to become more common, not less common in the years to come. Okay, very briefly, on the history that I study, I don't want to spend too much time on that now, although I'm for better or worse, like a lot of professors, I could talk for hours about this stuff if you let me, but you shouldn't let me. I don't want to take up too much time with it. Very briefly, a lot of what I study focuses on the Nazi era specifically, the 1930s and the 1940s in German history. And there was a, there was a minority strand, a subordinate strand within Nazism. It was not the majority strand within Nazism. It was not the predominant view, but there was a minority strand within Nazism that did take ecological concerns extremely seriously, and who came up with some, in some ways, some remarkably creative, if deeply frightening, but remarkably creative ways to try to address what they saw as the environmental problems that Nazi Germany faced in the 1930s and the 1940s. So I study those tendencies in great detail, so much so that I often, like I said before, any researcher who spends a lot of time studying things, I can lose sense of the proportions here. So I don't want to overplay the significance of those so-called green strands within Nazism, but they were real. That's not a figment of anybody's imagination. And for what it's worth, there's a much longer historical tradition in Germany that goes way before the Nazi era of linking environmental worldviews with various far-right political frameworks. Whether or not we call those versions of far-right politics fascist, there's a very lengthy tradition there in Germany of that, in my view, that unfortunate connection between environmentalism and the far right. In the United States as well, this is not primarily what my research is about, but because I'm from the United States and I live and teach here, I pay very close attention to it in the United States as well. Many members of the founding generation of conservationists, not all of them, but many members of the first several generations of conservationists were simultaneously involved in eugenics. In fact, a couple of them were deeply involved in the eugenics movement. And in their view, in their minds at the time, a century or more ago, there was no contradiction there. In fact, they thought those two things fit perfectly together. They thought that a commitment to environmental purity, if you want to understand this as a kind of politics of purity, they thought that a commitment to environmental purity fit perfectly with a commitment to what they saw as racial purity. They thought that a purified natural world and purified human social communities, they thought those two things went ideally hand in hand. Now, those things are not specific to Germany. They're not specific to the United States or to North America. You can trace extremely similar, very disturbingly similar trends in France, in Britain, in Russia, in Italy, in Scandinavia, in Australia, in lots of other societies, lots of other cultures around the world. And it's not just a historical phenomenon. Even though that's what I study, I tend to study things that happened 100 years ago. There are very virulent strands of the same kind of thinking on parts of today's far right. Some of you are probably familiar with the term alt-right. That's a term that's become more popular, more widely used in the last few years. A lot of people on the so-called alt-right have begun to strongly identify with their own version of ecological politics. Again, far from denying the reality of the ecological crisis, which many older generations of rightists used to do, a lot of those younger folks who find the alt-right appealing, they take environmental politics seriously and try to turn them into a radical right direction. So that's a big part of what I study. Because I don't want to take up too much time, I'd like to turn now to look at a really important question that I think doesn't get as much attention as it sometimes deserves. And that's the question, what can we do about it? If you are willing to buy for a moment that at least part of the very brief analysis that I just laid out is true, if you think it is the case that there are elements on the far right, historically as well as today, that do take ecological themes seriously and that have developed a potentially, at least in my view, a potentially dangerous form of anti-immigrant politics around that, if that's true, if you think that that's a real thing that's happening in the world, then the question is, how can we respond to it? How can people of conscience reply to that phenomenon? How can people who support immigrant communities, instead of demonizing them, instead of blaming everything from social decay to environmental destruction on them, how can we respond to a rising wave of far-right agitation that sometimes takes a confoundingly environmental form, and that then tends to target its ire against immigrant communities, not just immigrant communities, but it's a very, very common theme. How can we respond to that? Now, unfortunately, I don't have great answers to that question. I do have some thoughts that I want to share with you, and then we can try to move into a broader discussion of these issues. But these are not, I don't think that I have solved that problem by any means. But because I spent a lot of my time reflecting on it, I can at least offer a couple of starting points. For one thing, I think we can begin, for those of us who do want to take this problem seriously, I think we can begin, especially for those of us who are white. I cannot see most of you, and even if I could, I would try not to make assumptions about how you racially identify. But for people like me, for those of us who do come from a white background, I think it's especially important to think that we can actively make common cause with immigrant communities and with communities of color. Those two are not the same thing in the United States, although they often overlap. We can make common cause with those communities who are already engaged in environmental justice work. And I'm going to guess that that's a term, I'm going to hope that that's a term that's already familiar enough here. The notion of environmental justice is one that doesn't just take environmental concerns seriously, but also tries to see how environmental problems are unequally distributed, so to speak, throughout a society. The ways in which very, very frequently the worst impacts when environmental disasters happen, they don't just happen equally to everyone. They routinely fall harder on communities of color, on communities that lack resources, on immigrant communities, and so on and so forth. Because of that unfortunate historical fact, there's a very long tradition of immigrant communities and communities of color in the United States and all over the world engaging very actively in attempts at environmental change, in attempts at environmental reform, or even more radical change, not just environmental reform, but environmental transformation. And that the term that's often used to describe that phenomenon is environmental justice. I think that part is important, not least because it can help to dismantle a myth that is pretty widespread these days. Now, you might have noticed that a few minutes ago I said that all of these different progenitors, previous generations, the founding generations of the American conservation movement, so many of them were involved in eugenics and held racial ideologies. That's true, but that's only half the story. Among the alt-right today, there is a very frequently bandied about belief, they frame it in different ways, but that many of them believe that environmentalism has been a primarily or even an exclusively white movement. Sometimes they say it's a proud Aryan movement. Now, when they say that, they don't mean it critically. They mean that they want to celebrate the supposed white roots of environmentalism. I think it's important for us to break down that myth, because it simply isn't true. There is an equally long history in the United States and in other countries, an equally long history of communities of color, often being the most courageous, the most innovative, the most creative participants in various environmental struggles over the decades. African American communities that have a century and a half of history of involvement in environmental struggles, especially in the United States, especially Native American communities. Much of the history of US environmentalism is incomprehensible if we don't pay attention to the Native American and the many different Native American contributions to that history. And last but hardly least, Latinx communities, Latino communities, so-called Hispanic communities, very lengthy tradition of involvement in those environmental justice causes. Since that is the case, those of us who don't necessarily come from those communities, we have the possibility of actively making common cause with some of those struggles. That is one way to try to respond to things like the rise of far-right versions of environmentalism. Second possible response, we can point out the ecological absurdity of fixating on national borders as if they were some sort of imaginary environmental defense, because that's what a lot of far-right ecological thought, a lot of so-called eco-fascism, that's what it comes down to, is this belief, this clearly mistaken belief, that national borders, things like the border between the United States and Canada, which for many hundreds of miles is simply a line drawn on a map, an exceedingly straight line, or even things like the Mexico-United States border, part of which follows an important river, but it's not like there's an impenetrable mountain range between Mexico and the United States, most national borders, with the exception of island countries, most national borders aren't like that. They're usually arbitrary historical creations. And the thing that we can try to poke away at is it just doesn't make the slightest bit of ecological sense to pretend that closing our borders, kicking out the immigrants, shutting things down, don't let anybody else in, it just doesn't make any ecological sense to think that that would have positive environmental effects. Because we know that things like air pollution, that doesn't magically stop at national borders. How could it? Anybody who paid attention, some of you of a generation who knew a lot about acid rain, once we figured out what acid rain was and what was causing it, when Canadian forests took the brunt of plants in Ohio magically crossing national borders, things like that simply don't stop at national borders. In a 21st century perspective, the obvious case is climate change. Climate change does not stop at any national border. Even those island countries that are otherwise a little bit buffered, we're all impacted by climate change. So another possible response is for us to actually pay a little bit of attention to what far-right environmentalists say, and when they try to fall back on close the borders, kick out the immigrants, that will protect our natural environment, we can point out that that notion is both socially abhorrent, or at least I find it socially abhorrent, but it's also ecologically absurd. It just doesn't make any sense. Last, this is my final thing, and then we can try to move into a more open discussion. I think that we can help create an emancipatory ecological politics. In fact, we don't have to create it. There's already so many examples of that have been created by previous generations of activists. They don't always agree with each other. There's still a lot of very important debates to be had there, but we can help participate in, take part in an emancipatory ecological movement, one that embraces everybody on a global scale, instead of drawing invidious distinctions between us and them, between our country and those other people from somewhere else. Instead of circling the wagons around whatever community you happened to be born into and grow up in, we can work toward an ecological politics that does away with those distinctions and recognizes we are in this boat together, folks. Climate change is exactly the kind of global crisis that is not going to spare anybody, no matter where you live on the planet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can also demand, by the way, that social movements confront the ecological crisis. A whole lot of them do already. That's not something that's news to a lot of social movement activists out there, but we can ask that insight be spread as far and wide as possible. And we can work toward an environmental movement that takes justice seriously, both social justice and environmental justice. If we can figure out ways of doing that, not just in our heads, not just realigning our ideas, but actually changing the way we act in the world, changing the ways we get involved. And for those of us who are involved in environmental activism and organizing in various environmental struggles, if we can find ways of changing those aspects of how we approach human relations with the natural world, I think it means we're not doomed to watching another series of 2019 massacres in El Paso and Christchurch completely repeat themselves. We can actually change that historical trajectory. Okay, that's about all that I prepared for today. I would love to get some vigorous conversation going. Lorraine, as I understand things, we have the option of both putting questions in the chat, but also doing them live in person. Is that correct? And do you want to be our moderator for that?
Yes, I will. I'll do my best to do that. And there is a question or two on chat. The first one, let me get there. I can't move. There. Okay. The first one is from Ann Batiza, and she's asking, what are examples of environmental causes supported by the far right, given that environmental justice issues are usually left activist causes?
Excellent question. The easiest example that comes to mind for me is organic farming. And it comes to mind easily for me because I am a strong, lifelong committed supporter of organic farming. So nothing that I say right now should ever be construed as in any way, I don't want to scare anyone away from supporting organics as much as humanly possible. But again, just as a simple matter of historical fact, many of the better known organic movements in the world today, which now let's say after 1968 to keep things simple, which now often take on a clearly left emancipatory progressive perspective. Many of them have historical roots on the right, very often on the far right. That's true in Australia, which is a country I don't study, but other scholars do. It's true in France. The most recent book that came out, it's in English, it's by an American historian about the organic movement in France in the early and mid 20th century. It's true in some extent in Germany. One of the main strands of those, I mentioned those green strands within Nazism before, one of those main strands centered on a form of organic farming. That's one of those things that has long been susceptible to appropriation by the far right, because if you think about it, it fits a lot of far right goals. It involves values like health. I already mentioned purity. Health is a big one for a lot of people on the far right. A healthy people, a healthy nation, a healthy race, a healthy stock. That's a big part of what drives them. It's a big part of what animates them. And they look at organics as a way to make their people healthier, to improve the racial stock and so on and so forth. But it also helps to make the soil healthier. And as it happens, that's true. That's one of the reasons why I support organic farming. That's not something that the far right invented. It is actually the case. But in their worldview, in their political mindset, they tend to spin that in a direction that seems deeply alien to people who don't share those far right principles. But if you're willing to think about this from the far right's point of view, I know that's asking a lot. Historians have to do this. We have to try to put ourselves in the shoes of the historical figures we study, even when those figures held views that we find deeply strange and often deeply repellent. But if you're willing to do that, there's a kind of logic there. If you think about it, you could see why some elements on the far right for generations now have been strongly drawn to organic farming. And I also have to say, unfortunately, there are some strands within organic farming movements that have affected a kind of non-political stance, who've basically said, look, I don't know about politics. My job is to grow healthy food and help the soil to recover and try to avert complete ecological disaster, all of which is awesome and great, and we owe those people a lot, but who then don't take the next step of saying, and that's why I simply can't support when my movement gets appropriated and taken over by various far right actors. So I think there's some work to be done on both sides there. That's really just one example. Actually, I'm inclined to stop there, so we have room for other questions.
There's more.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. Let's go on to the next one, Lorraine. I have not been paying close enough attention to the chat.
That's okay. This one's from John, and he thanks you for the thoughtful presentation. But also his question: since air pollution, climate change, and the like are, for example, globalism, don't respect borders, aren't border less relevant today than years past? Should that be a discussion our leadership as well as we discuss? That's his comment question.
Yeah. And I like the following part too, which I take it is also from John. Nationalism seems to fuel separation. Yeah. And an us versus them mentality. Mm-hmm. As it happens, I completely agree with you. It is worth pointing out, there's a lot of different forms of nationalism in the world today. And I have a number of friends and colleagues who try to take a more cosmopolitan approach to what they view as a primary commitment to their own country. They don't often use the term nationalism to describe that. They sometimes call it progressive patriotism. That's not my thing, for what it's worth. I'm not all that excited about that form of politics myself, but I want to respect it. I want to respect people who are trying to change the more usual connotations that nationalism has typically had. But the point here that I think is so important is it should be the case, given what we now know about the nature of the 21st century ecological crisis, given what we now know about the global impacts of sometimes local and regional decisions. If you think about it, we live in a country right here in the United States that has a relatively small proportion of the total population of the entire Earth, but that produces an astonishingly high proportion of the total emissions of greenhouse gases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's something that the rest of the world is acutely aware of. As long as we keep those disparities in mind, it is actually true that national borders, they're less and less important in ecological terms. In an earlier 20th century context, 100 years ago, in a 19th century context, it made a little more sense to argue that there must be some sort of inherent connection between closing the borders, protecting us from them, and protecting our natural resources. In the 21st century, for reasons I spelled out a few minutes ago, I just don't think that argument holds water anymore. And I think we need to make that argument a larger part of public debates around climate change and around the global nature of the ecological crisis than it has been so far. Whether that is a question for the leadership to address, that I can't speak to. I would love to see at least some people in positions of responsibility tackling those questions honestly.
There's 3 more questions, and then after Mary, the last question, then we'll go to hand raising and maybe some discussion. But there is a question here, a concern that calling the eco movement fascist minimizes or could cause problems for environmental movement.
Absolutely. Hank, you are 100% right. What I was trying to sort of vaguely point to at the beginning of my remarks is I take responsibility. Janet and I both, my longtime colleague, we both take responsibility for having helped make the term eco-fascism much better known than it was before our little book came out. But both of us are decidedly uncomfortable with a very large range of the meanings that term has since taken on, even though it's not what we meant by it. Just to put it out there, there's any number of people today who use the term eco-fascism to basically say anybody who stakes out a strong environmental stance is somehow a fascist. By that argument, I would be an eco-fascist myself, which is one of the reasons why I think that argument collapses when you examine it critically for a few seconds. Nonetheless, that's a pretty widely held position, not on the far right necessarily, but in large stretches of the contemporary United States conservative scene. That is a pretty common stance. They look at people like me and they think I'm an eco-fascist. If you believe that there is a place for radically reshaping contemporary human economic norms. I see the next question is about capitalism. So if you think, like me, that capitalism is a really huge problem that needs to be radically reshaped, in the eyes of some conservatives, that would make me an eco-fascist. So I think Hank is right to point to this problem. I guess the best response I can come up with, it's not a perfect response. It doesn't entirely address Hank's question. But the best response I can come up with is this. In my view, when a political movement discovers that its own past is a lot more complicated than we wish it was, when we figure out that there's a lot more political ambiguity and ambivalence built into the history of the environmental movement, once we realize that that is the case, I think we have a kind of obligation not to downplay the less savory aspects of our own history. I think instead, that means we should take a longer and harder look, a more critical look at those less well-known aspects of our own history as environmental activists. And that, I think, eventually, if we do it right, that will help strengthen the environmental movement rather than weakening it. It'll show everybody else out there that some of us are serious about confronting that part of our legacy and transcending it and moving beyond it.
Yes. Capitalism, with its emphasis on production, consumption, and resource extraction, conflicts with ecological justice. How should left activists be skeptical of mega industry solutions?
Yep, excellently put. And I happen to agree with that. I am, like virtually every environmental historian you will ever meet in your lives, I am deeply skeptical toward capitalism. It comes with the territory. If you study the history of what are the economic and social forces over the past few hundred years that have primarily been responsible for the deepening ecological crisis, you tend to end up taking a highly critical approach to the history of capitalism. That's not true for everybody in the environmental movement. There's a lot of people who work long and hard, deeply committed environmentalists who work long and hard to get the people in positions of corporate responsibility to change their ways. And again, I do not condemn that approach. I respect and admire and sort of give moral support to that approach, even if it's not where I'm at myself politically. But if you think about it, over the longer term, I agree with Anne. I simply don't see a way right now, barring fantastical technological discoveries yet to be made, I don't see a way right now to be able to reconcile the basic structures of capitalism, not just its worst impacts, not just the worst sides of capitalism, but its basic foundational operations. I don't see a way to reconcile that with the kind of planet that we actually live on. And if we're serious about making the planet's long-term future and human society's long-term future, we think that matters more than short-term concerns, as important as they might be about prosperity and growth, et cetera. Eventually, we're going to face a really fundamental choice. I think we can either end up sticking with a basic form of capital society, or we can choose an ecologically sustainable society. I don't think we're going to be able to choose both.
Wow. Okay. Last question on chat is from Mary. How do the two forces work together? Some from the far right tend to oppose regulations, for example, manufacturing and pollution, that protect the environment, yet they are pro-environment.
Yeah, excellent question. To try to break that down, it requires thinking a little bit about the distinctions between what you might call the conventional right or the established right, and the people that I'm talking about who are much further to the right. People on the far right today, in the United States, in lots of parts of Europe and other parts of the world, people on the far right today are deeply disgusted with what they view as conventional conservatives or established conservatives. It's true that they mostly hate people like me. They really hate and loathe and despise leftists, but they're also no friends of the people that they rightly or wrongly view as conventional, mainstream, established conservatives. That's, if you paid attention to some of what was going on with the riot at the Capitol on January 6th, you probably picked up on that undercurrent. So the further to the right that you go, the far right end of the spectrum, you're likely to find people who believe two things at once. One, the current regime of regulation, the existing parameters for state or government regulation of the private sector, that is so, in their view, that is so completely wrong-headed that it's not worth saving at all. They basically want to get rid of the state as it exists now. They want to get rid of the government as it exists now. But here's the second thing. They want to do so, some of them want to do so, in the name of a better environmental policy. They don't want to do so because they're opposed to all forms of regulation. They want to do so because they think the current forms are indebted to liberal assumptions, that they're much too limited, that they focus on small producers, which is what many of them view themselves as, instead of focusing on really large corporations. A lot of people on the far right hate and despise large corporations. That might sound strange for those of us on the left who are no fans of large corporations, but there is some definite overlap there. So for some folks on the far right, they want to topple the current regime of regulation so that some new form of society, which they don't really have a very clear idea at all of what it might look like, it will have white people in charge. It will have people who are not already politicians and don't work for large corporations in charge. Beyond that, they get a little bit vague, but their belief is that with that new regime, we could radically remake society in the United States so that the environment is actually respected and not just subjected to a series of, in their views, pretend regulations. I don't think that viewpoint makes much sense, but I want us to try to at least comprehend where it's coming from.
Thank you. Okay. We'll go to raising of hands, and I'm looking now for someone with a question. Most people are off the screen. Okay.
I can see a couple.
I think see, I'm not, well, if you see, I'm very bad at moving. Bruce, go ahead.
Bruce, rescue us.
Yeah, I want to make a comment on an issue I heard about just last night that is somewhat related to this. There is I think a big corporation working on building a wind farm in western Wisconsin in the driftless area. And there are people who are opposing it, even though we direly need alternative energy. But they are criticizing corporate greed and disregarding the grassroots and their preferences and all of that. So a very interesting time. I want people to kind of be aware of it. It's being depicted as locals versus corporations, energy versus greed. Just a very interesting. It sounds like, Peter, you've heard about this. I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments about it, but a very interesting dynamic politically and socially.
You have lots of comments. Lorraine, my instinct at this point would be to collect a couple of questions at once, unless you think that's a bad idea.
Yeah, there is someone now, if you're ready for another idea. That's Dennis. Dennis Merritt.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Just really stimulated by your presentation. I'm an eco-psychologist, Jungian analyst, and I've done a lot of study about the connection to the land. I'm particularly interested in the Nazis and the land and the soil, because when you think of the indigenous cultures, I mean, their language emerged out of the lands. Their myths were connected to the land. And could you say something about the Nazis and the land, and then maybe contrast that with Americans, where we came here, all immigrants, no connection, no religious connection to the land, but this Christian idea of the white city on the hill and all that. And could you kind of comment about, maybe contrast the American connection to the Europeans' connection to the land?
Excellent question.
Can you gather one more? There was
sure.
Anne. Anne,
Bring
did
one
you
more
still
on.
have a question?
Hi,
Anne?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And then I think we'll kind of see what time we're at after the answers to these three questions. How about that? But go ahead, Anne. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for your answers. Two things I want to mention is, one is that often activist movements are divided when we allow for a left-right division. And so I'm wondering to what extent environmental justice or activism can capitalize on left plus right support for particular environmental ideas. And the second thing is that if you spend any time in the West, in Arizona and New Mexico, people have a much different relationship to the land. And I'm just wondering to what extent the ideas that you're talking about come out of that experience of living in a very different environment from the environment that we find ourselves in here in Wisconsin.
All three of these are great questions. Okay, briefly. Bruce's question is great. Bruce, I don't actually know any specifics about this new thing in the driftless area. That you were the first person I've heard talk about it, so I would need to go look into the details. But it is nonetheless a very familiar dynamic. In fact, I'm guessing I might actually know some of those folks over in Western Wisconsin. I lived in Madison for 15 years, and I knew a lot of amazing folks that lived up in that part of the state. But I don't know anything at all about those specific details, so I cannot speak to them, but I can definitely speak to the general dynamics going on there. That sense of local needs versus large corporations, that has been a part of the animating, the dynamism behind many environmental movements for a really long time, back into the 19th century already. That's not a 21st century phenomenon by any means. And it very often has a powerful emancipatory potential to it. If you think it through, if we could work toward a society where local communities did actually have the chance to outweigh the interests of corporations that jump from place to place and extract as much profit as they can and then go away and never return. If we could work toward a society like that, it might make it easier to come up with more ecologically sustainable forms of economic activity. So I want to recognize the strong, positive potential there. But I also want to point out that depending on how you spin it, depending on the political context that you put those beliefs into, there is a potential underside to a strong emphasis on local over everything else. Local concerns must trump all things. There have been cases where that fixation on the local has led people to take what I would consider fairly reactionary stance. And again, I have no idea whether any of this applies or not in the specific case going on right now, but it has arisen in some cases in past struggles along those lines. If you take a purely local, a sort of myopic local view, and you forget about the ways in which we are now all globally connected at the social level and at the ecological level, that I think can become hazardous. So I would want us to try to think through clearly and critically what's involved when we pit local concerns against global corporations, not so that we stop doing it, but so that we're able to do it in a way that's more effective over the long term. Dennis's question goes straight to the heart of what I study. The term that the so-called green Nazis used repeatedly, the term that was their slogan, was blood and soil. They thought that there was an intense, deep connection between German blood. They believed that there was something that you could identify as German blood, which for them was a kind of racial identity. They thought there was a deep and intense connection between having German blood and taking a respectful and responsible approach to the German soil. Hence, in their view, only German farmers and German foresters and what have you would ever be able to respect the ecological environmental needs of German society. The problem is that in a Nazi context, you're all aware that the Nazis came to power in the 1930s. In the 1930s, Germany was one of the most advanced industrial countries on the planet, one of the top three, basically. And in a society like that, in the 1930s, what that kind of vision almost inevitably demanded was imperial expansion. Germany already had very densely populated cities at the time. Germany, within Germany's borders, then didn't have extra space to move into and turn into farmland or forests or what have you. So the implication was very often, if Germany is going to be able to return to an agrarian society that actually respects its environmental boundaries, which was the vision of these so-called green Nazis, the only way they were going to be able to do that was to take over a whole bunch of land that Germans then did not currently occupy. That meant kicking out the Polish occupants or the Ukrainian occupants, especially the Jewish occupants. Eventually, it meant, of course, killing them, although for what it's worth, a lot of the green Nazis lost power before the Holocaust itself kicked in, but they very much helped to set the stage for that expansionist vision. That, I think, is in some ways peculiar to the German situation in the 1930s. I am reluctant to draw too many larger lessons for that, for the broader history of right-wing ecology, but it is certainly a chilling example that I think we should all keep in mind. Last, Anne's question about the left-right division is a wonderful question. This is a debate that I've had many, many times over the years. My own view is a little different from Anne's, I think, if I understood you correctly, but that's fine. My own views on this should not carry more weight than anybody else's. What I think you're basically pointing to, Anne, is that there's two possible ways that we could respond to the notion that there are both left and right versions of environmental concern. We could respond in the sort of critical and deeply concerned way that I have implicitly been arguing for, or we could take a more hopeful approach that says maybe there's potential for reasonable cooperation here. Maybe we could use environmental issues as a way to finally overcome these obsolete and inherited left-right distinctions. Now, even though I don't actually take that second tack myself, for better or worse, I'm stuck on the critical and concerned end of the spectrum, I do think that is worth considering. The one thing I would warn against is there are at least some forces on the far right, and have been since the 1950s onward. There have been some forces on the far right who can see that they have potential to make recruits there. One of the reasons why the so-called alt-right has been successful is that it's been able to dress itself up in symbols that appeal to a younger generation who take things like ecology very seriously. So even though there is positive potential available there, that we could transcend the old left-right distinctions, I also want us to be really thoughtful and careful about how we step into that territory so that we don't play into the hands of far-rightists looking to recruit more people to their cause.
Well, maybe we can call 12:15 the end. There is one more thing from Anne. She said, if there's time, might we address the environmental concerns of the TPP?
TPP?
What is that, Anne? I'm unclear. Uh-oh.
So the TPP, it was, it's actually been promoted much more by liberals. It was
the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
No, the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Okay.
And the reality. Okay.
Gotcha. Yeah. Come to think of it, that's true. I admit I have not given all that much historical thought to this particular instance before, but you're onto something. You know, if you ask me, a lot of standard forms of liberalism fall into some of the same traps that some of the standard forms of conservatism fall into on issues like this. They tend not to question the standard institutional landscape, where you have large corporate bodies which can do good or evil depending on how hard you nudge them and in which direction. And then you have large state bodies which can also do good or evil depending on who's in control and who's pushing them in one direction or another. For a lot of liberals and a lot of conservatives, that's just the way the world works. And their politics is all about how do we tug it in this direction versus tugging it in that direction. For some of the rest of us, whose politics lie beyond standard liberal and conservative, who are further to the left or further to the right, that's not really the way the world works. That's more a sort of coincidental, that's the way things happen to operate right now in 2021. But we know historically, for better and for worse, we know historically that there's no guarantee of that particular institutional arrangement persisting for all time. It wasn't necessarily there in earlier versions of the societies that we live in now, and we shouldn't just assume that it will continue into the future. And that, again, is where we face this really interesting challenge. We can take a hopeful view about that. We can say that gives us, for people who think of themselves as environmental activists committed to an ecological transformation of society, that leaves a lot of really creative possibilities open for the future. And all I want to remind us is some folks on the far right are acutely aware of those possibilities as well, and they are eager to exploit them. And I want us to think through the social and political implications of that very complex history.
So
Yeah.
the way the TPP is written right now, corporations will override local laws that protect workers, local environmental laws, they're guaranteed profits. It's so terrible for the environment. It is so awful, and yet people don't know about it. It's not discussed, and unfortunately, it is liberals who are pushing this. So to me, it's a huge contradiction.
Yeah, Bruce is also right. That's a great example, but it's one of several examples along those lines. In my view, unfortunately, since the Citizens United decision, which is 13 years ago or something now, it's been really hard in the US to push back against those notions of corporate, the degree to which corporations have a kind of autonomy. That has been extremely hard to confront in an effective way. I think we are learning ways to do that better, but we have some more work to do.
I just want to say one other thing. It was.
Go ahead. What?
It was WikiLeaks who exposed the negotiations on the TPP and provided people with the documents about what was really going on. And before that, there was no
secrecy
coverage.
Yep. That is a very good point. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh my goodness. I think at one point in our emails, Peter, you said something about animation. You are animated.
I am. Sorry.
And I appreciate it so much. And thank you for being with us today. I know we need much more information from you, but it's the best we can do. So
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Lorraine and Bruce, you have my permission, so to speak, to share my email with anyone who wants it. I'm not that hard to find. Find me at Marquette and you'll find my Marquette email. Don't be shy about sending follow-up questions and comments and critiques my way.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.